We turn now to our commemoration of the March on Washington. First, a few words from Charmaine McKissick Melton of Durham, North Carolina. Her father, the late Floyd McKissick, then national chairman of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, spoke at the original event.
My father, as one of the leaders, was told they did not want children at the march in case something might happen. When we turned on the TV, we were really, really disappointed that we weren't there because we saw lots of kids there. But my father was not supposed to be a speaker at the march. It was supposed to be a core person, and of course that would be the director, who was James Farmer. We call him Jim Farmer. So, but Jim was arrested, and he was in Louisiana, so therefore my father was called on as the second in command of CORE to be a speaker at the march. I remember that he was probably more staged than normal, I felt. He tended to be a little fierier, not quite a gospel, not quite a Baptist minister, but I think he pretty much kind of stuck to the script, it seemed to me, more than normal. To Charmaine, my lovely daughter, the future is yours. Your generation will have to continue the struggle for change. It is my faith in you and other youth that I rely on. Your daddy, Floyd McKissick.
That was Charmaine McKissick Melton from Durham, North Carolina. You can find her story and other firsthand accounts for the web series Memories of the March, produced by public television stations around the country, on the PBS website Black Culture Connection.
Now to our own coverage of the anniversary. Thousands gathered Saturday to mark the occasion on the National Mall, the site of the original march. Elected officials, activists, and civil rights leaders addressed the crowd, calling for a more expansive interpretation of Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream.
As we gather today, 50 years later, their march is now our march, and it must go on. And our focus has broadened to include the cause of women, of Latinos, of Asian Americans, of lesbians, of gays, of people with disabilities, and of countless others across this great country who still yearn for equality, opportunity, and fair treatment.
I keep hearing people talking about Dr. King's dream. When I was younger, I said to my mother, my friends say, why are we dreaming? You need to be awake to fight. But my mother said to me, you got to understand what dreams are for. Dreams are for those that won't accept reality as it is. So they dream of what is not there and make it possible.
Also speaking Saturday, the slain civil rights leader's son, Martin Luther King III.
I, like you, continue to feel his presence. I, like you, continue to hear his voice crying out in the wilderness. The admonition is clear. This is not the time for a nostalgic commemoration, nor is this the time for self-congratulatory celebration. The task is not done. Their journey is not complete.
The passage of 50 years has altered the way we consider the march, especially for those who marched and those not yet born. I spoke recently with civil rights leader Cleveland Sellers, who was there in 1963 and was active in the movement, and his son, South Carolina State Representative Bakari Sellers, who is now running for lieutenant governor in their home state. Cleveland Sellers, Bakari Sellers, thank you both for joining us. Since age brings wisdom, I'm going to start first with Cleveland Sellers, who went through so much in your career as a civil rights activist. You were arrested after the Orangeburg Massacre. You were part of Freedom Summer, and you marched on Washington in 1963. So many turning points that happened during that time. What about the march was different for you?
Well, the march occurred in 1963, and at that point I was an 18-year-old sophomore at Howard University, and I had been keeping up with all of the activities of young people across the South primarily in their efforts to sit in and freedom rides, and then you had the students in Birmingham who face the water hoses and the dogs. And later that summer, '63, you had the murder of Medgar Evers. And so we began to feel, young people, like we were beginning to make our point known, and that is that we were experiencing a unique time in our lives where we wanted to say that we wanted our freedom and we wanted it now. And so we had an opportunity to be involved in the March on Washington, and I had an opportunity to be a volunteer there in Washington, D.C. And the night before the march, I spent a lot of time making posters and making sandwiches, cheese sandwiches. I think some 70,000 posters, and I can't remember how many cheese sandwiches we actually made. But I was there the very next morning, and it was a thrill seeing all of these buses and cars and masses of people coming to Washington with different objectives in mind.
Bakari Sellers, you were barely a gleam in your parents' eye. Your mother's name is Gwen. I kind of like that. So tell me, how did you first learn about that day? How did you first learn about the march?
Well, my upbringing was a little bit different than most, in that I didn't necessarily have to go and open up a library book. I didn't have to wait for my 3rd or 4th grade teachers to educate me on Briggs v. Elliott or Brown versus the Board of Education or Sarah Mae Fleming or the March on Washington. For me, growing up, the son of Dr. Cleveland Sellers and Gwendolyn Sellers, I understood that they really felt those prison floors. They understood what the smell of gun smoke smelled like. It wasn't anything that they actually had to dream up or read about in a history book, but for them, it was real life. Growing up and hearing stories about the March on Washington, I think the most unique thing that stood out and still stands out to me to this day about that journey was that it was sparked by young people. It was young people that were 14, 15, 16 years old, 21, 22, 23 years old. And, I got this little basic understanding that if not me, then who? And if not now, then when? And without those young people, without those young visions, those young hearts, those young people who were filled with courage, and some oftentimes radical sense of invincibility, I wouldn't have the opportunities I have today. So for me, the March on Washington was a moment in time, a moment in history that we look back on and we learn from.
Well, let me ask your dad this question, because I wonder if this is something that you set out to do as a parent. You decided that it was important that your children take this in, not just from the history books, but in reality.
Yes, but I thought that it was important for us to transfer many of those experiences and that knowledge to young people in general. And I just had the opportunity to carry my children around with me as I was engaged in other kinds of civil rights-oriented activities. They had an opportunity to meet many of the legends of the civil rights era. The Andy Youngs and the Stokely Carmichaels and the Diane Nashes and the John Lewis, and the list goes on and on and on. But I thought that that was so important for young people, and I should start with my own in terms of making sure that they understood that history and understood that struggle.
Bakari, why did you decide, after watching your father's and your mother's example, why did you decide elective politics? Why was that the path?
My father and mother both, they always taught us, one, that education was the gateway to the American dream, and always have this insatiable desire to learn as much as possible. But I'll always remember growing up, my dad used to just drill in our head to make sure you're a change agent, no matter what field you go into, whether or not you're in medicine like my sister or the ministry like my brother or where I am now, make sure you're a change agent. And for me, I had an opportunity to work for United States Congressman Jim Clyburn, and I had an opportunity to work for Mayor Shirley Franklin. But I understood that it's not about politics, it's about public service. And I had the audacity to run for office when I was 20 years old. I announced I was going to run when I was 21 years old and win. And now we're running for lieutenant governor, all because my father and others like him have given so much to the state of South Carolina. And I really feel it's my responsibility to give as much as I have to make sure that people have access. And they fought for access during the March on Washington, and although our goals have changed, I still believe my mission to be true.
Cleveland Sellers, when you look back now, 50 years later, do you think that the goals of the march were accomplished?
Well, I think we have to start with what happened 2.5 weeks after the march, and that was the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, where reality set in, and that was that your freedom was not going to be just given to you, and that struggle was going to be a lifelong struggle for many of us who were very young at that particular period of time. And as we have gone through, we have seen that there were achievements beyond the March on Washington. I think the march actually mobilized people and give you an opportunity to talk about specific issues, but you have to do the grunt work, and that is the organizing. So you begin to see young people go across the South and begin to organize. You saw Selma and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. You saw the Mississippi Summer Project and the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. You saw affirmative action. You saw all of these things grow out of that. You saw an effort to empower marginalized people across the country who used the model that we were using in terms of organizing for a kind of self-determination and pulling people together so they could take control of their own lives. Those models were actually those things that grew out of the movement. I think that the March on Washington is one of those epic points, but there are a number of other epic points that actually pull this whole process together. And I think it's important that we understand the struggle that even went on in the March on Washington to get the message out.
Let me flash forward and staying with you, Cleveland Sellers, to the present. We're still having big national conversations, as they say, about race. We're just coming out of the Trayvon Martin episode. And I wonder if you look back, you wonder whether it's leadership that's missing, whether we're just not honest as a people in discussing these issues, or whether we've come much farther than we give ourselves credit for.
I think we have come a long ways, but what you have to recognize is that you have to have committed people who are constantly being vigilant and making sure that things that happen are not happening to undo the progress that has been made. I look at the rollback of affirmative action. I look at the attack on the Voting Rights Act just recently. I look at the unemployment and those kinds of issues. It's ironic that in 2013, looking back 50 years, that the message, March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, applicable even today.
Bakari, Sellers, the same question to you. What is your sense of how far we have or have not come in the 50 years since?
For me, we brought up the Trayvon Martin case, and one thing that I've learned to do is kind of look at things from a 50,000-foot view. And for me, it's much larger than that. And we have a generation of African-American young men who are growing up hopeless and full of despair. And we have to figure out why that is. On a larger scale, my father recently talked about the Voting Rights Act and voter ID and some of the attacks that have been made against the Voting Rights Act. And you can't help but to believe we're on the brink of chaos in this country. But the challenge for me and my generation is still to build community. And I think we've made progress. But I think when you look at where we are today, you understand we still have yet a ways to go. And my challenge, and I task a lot of people in my generation, is to understand the nuances of what we're dealing with. For me, it's no longer black and white. The issues of my father's generation are still very much prevalent today, but it's not as much black and white as it is the haves versus have-nots, and ensuring that everybody, no matter their race, creed, or color, or socioeconomic level, or where they grow up in the state of South Carolina or the United States of America, has access and the ability to achieve the American dream.
From South Carolina, each breaking through in his own way and in his own generation. Bakari Sellers, Cleveland Sellers, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
We continue our series tomorrow with Democratic Congressman John Lewis of Georgia. He's the former chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the only speaker at the 1963 march who is still alive. You can view all of our March on Washington coverage at newshour.pbs.org and watch speeches from Saturday on our YouTube page.
For my father was called on as the second in command of Corps to be a speaker at the march. I remember that he was probably more staged than normal, I felt. He tended to be a little fierier, not quite a gospel, not quite a Baptist minister, but I think he pretty much kind of stuck to the script, it seemed to me, more than normal. To Charmaine, my lovely daughter, the future is yours. Your generation will have to continue the struggle for change. It is my faith in you and other youth that I rely on. Your daddy, Floyd McKissick.
That was Charmaine McKissick Melton from Durham, North Carolina. You can find her story and other firsthand accounts for the web series Memories of the March, produced by public television stations around the country, on the PBS website Black Culture Connection.
They did not want children at the march in case something might happen. When we turned on the TV, we were really, really disappointed that we weren't there, because we saw lots of kids there. But my father was not supposed to be a speaker at the march. It was supposed to be a Corps person, and of course that would be the director, who was James Farmer. We call him Jim Farmer. So, but Jim was arrested, and he was in Louisiana, so therefore.
We turn now to our commemoration of the March on Washington. First, a few words from Charmaine McKissick Melton of Durham, North Carolina. Her father, the late Floyd McKissick, then national chairman of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, spoke at the original event.
My father, as one of the leaders, was told.
Now to our own coverage of the anniversary. Thousands gathered Saturday to mark the occasion on the National Mall, the site of the original march. Elected officials, activists, and civil rights leaders addressed the crowd, calling for a more expansive interpretation of Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream.
As we gather today, 50 years later, their march is now our march, and it must go on.